Berlin, April 1945. The heart of the Nazi Empire was collapsing in on itself. What had once been a city of parades and proclamations was now a graveyard of rubble and smoke. The Red Army was closing in from every direction, their artillery shaking the ground day and night. Hitler's once invincible Reich was down to a few city blocks, and somewhere beneath them, buried under layers of concrete, the dictator of Europe waited for the end. The Führerbunker lay hidden behind the Reich Chancellery, a gray labyrinth of corridors, sealed doors, and airless rooms. In that claustrophobic space, Adolf Hitler spent his final days surrounded by a handful of loyal followers. The outside world was already gone, reduced to ash and static. But down here, the illusion of command continued. Orders were still shouted, maps still marked with phantom armies, reports still delivered as if they meant something. Those who entered the bunker in those final weeks described a place both ordinary and terrifying. The air smelled of damp cement and stale tobacco. The walls trembled from constant bombardment. Sometimes dust fell from the ceiling like snow. Hitler himself was almost unrecognizable, his once fiery energy replaced by a gray, shaking frailty. His hand trembled uncontrollably. His eyes were red and hollow. Yet even as the city collapsed above him, he clung to the dream that salvation was only days away. He spoke of imaginary counterattacks, of Steiner's divisions that no longer existed, of miracle weapons that would turn the tide. His generals listened in silence, afraid to contradict him. Outside, the Soviet forces were already within 5 miles of the bunker. Inside, the man who had once ruled most of Europe was now ruling a world that existed only inside his own head. Eva Braun was there too. She had lived her life in the shadows, never officially acknowledged, always waiting behind the scenes. When offered a chance to escape, she refused. Instead, she arrived in Berlin just as the encirclement began. To her family, she wrote that she could not imagine life without him. In those final days, she smiled more than anyone else, as if denial had become her last act of defiance. Around them, the bunker community was disintegrating. Ministers, generals, secretaries, each trapped in their own mixture of loyalty, fear, and exhaustion. The sound of artillery had become constant, like a second heartbeat. Electricity flickered. Meals were reduced to canned rations and wine scavenged from the chancellery. Outside, people were starving. Inside, champagne was still occasionally poured. It was a world suspended between absurdity and death. By April 22nd, Hitler's illusion cracked. When he was told that General Steiner's attack had failed, witnesses described an explosion of rage unlike anything they had ever seen. He screamed, cursed his generals, and collapsed into a chair, shaking uncontrollably. For the first time, he admitted aloud that the war was lost. But even in that moment, surrender was unthinkable. He would not be captured. He would not face trial. His fate would be his own. From that point onward, his tone changed. He no longer gave commands with the authority of a leader. Instead, he dictated his last will and testament, dividing the remnants of his empire among men who no longer had armies. He spoke of treason and betrayal, of vengeance that would never come. He seemed both lucid and detached, as if already halfway out of the world. On April 29th, as artillery thundered above, Hitler and Eva Braun were married in a small ceremony inside the bunker. The witnesses described it as strangely calm, almost tender. After the vows, champagne was served. Some of the staff even danced to an old record on the gramophone. Outside, the walls shook from explosions, but down below, for a few fleeting moments, they pretended life still existed. The next morning, Hitler received the news that his ally, Mussolini, had been executed and hung upside down in Milan. The sight reportedly hardened his resolve. He would not allow himself to be paraded like that. He spent the rest of the morning in silence. Then, around 2:30 p.m., he withdrew to his private quarters with Eva Braun. They were calm, almost formal. She took cyanide. He sat beside her, lifted his pistol, and fired a single shot. Those in the corridor heard the sound, muffled by the thick bunker walls. When his valet entered moments later, the smell of gunpowder filled the room. Hitler was slumped on the sofa. Eva lay beside him, still. The man who had commanded millions had chosen his own ending in a space no larger than a living room. His body was carried up to the Chancellery garden, doused in gasoline, and set on fire under the shell-torn sky of Berlin. Within hours, Joseph Goebbels took command of what little was left. He gathered his family in another room of the bunker, feeding poison to his 6 children before taking his own life with his wife, Magda. One by one, the remaining occupants slipped away, some through suicide, others through surrender. When Soviet troops finally reached the chancellery, the once feared heart of the Nazi regime was silent. What happened to Hitler's remains would become one of the longest-running mysteries of the 20th century. The Soviets claimed they found his body, partially burned, in a shallow crater outside the bunker. They took the remains and buried them in secret, but Stalin himself ordered the information suppressed, fueling decades of rumors, stories of doubles, of submarines to South America, of Hitler living out his days under another name. In the years that followed, investigators from every corner of the world searched for proof. Files vanished. Witnesses contradicted one another. Some swore he had escaped. Others insisted he never could have. It wasn't until decades later, when fragments of skull and jawbone were compared against surviving dental records, that the mystery was finally laid to rest. The evidence pointed unmistakably to one conclusion: Hitler had died in the bunker. The place itself no longer exists. After the war, the Soviets sealed it, flooded it, and eventually buried it beneath what would become a parking lot in modern Berlin. Today, tourists walk unknowingly above the spot where one of history's darkest chapters ended. There are no monuments, no plaques, no ceremonies, only silence. Yet that silence speaks louder than any memorial. It tells of power reduced to paranoia, of a movement built on hate collapsing under its own lies, of a man who believed himself a god ending his life in fear and despair. The final days in the Führerbunker were more than the death of a dictator. They were the death of an illusion, the idea that tyranny could last forever. The concrete walls that once echoed with shouts and commands became a tomb, sealing in the madness that consumed a nation. History has tried to make sense of those last hours, to understand how millions followed a man who, in the end, could not even face the world he created. But perhaps the answer lies in the bunker itself, a world detached from reality, where denial was truth and destruction was destiny. When Berlin fell silent in May 1945, a new world began to form from the ruins. The Reich that was promised to last 1,000 years had survived barely 12. And beneath those ruins, in the cold gray stillness of a buried chamber, the myth of Adolf Hitler ended, not with triumph, but with ashes scattered in the wind.